The sun was just rising over the small rural village, casting golden streaks across the fields where a young boy worked before school. His hands were rough from labor, his clothes worn but clean. Every morning, he helped his father tend to their small farm before walking 3 miles to the only school in the area. The boy was quiet, always sitting in the back of the classroom, his eyes filled with a mix of determination and exhaustion. He wasn't like the other kids, his family had little, and it showed. But what he lacked in material things, he made up for in resilience. That morning, the teacher, a stern woman with a sharp tongue, stood at the front of the class, reviewing homework. When she reached the boy's desk, she paused, her lips curling into a smirk. "Again," she said loudly, holding up his tattered notebook. "You expect me to believe you did this work? A farmer's son, solving advanced math problems?" The class snickered. The boy's face burned, but he kept his voice steady. "I did it, ma'am. Every problem." She scoffed. "Maybe your father should teach you instead. After all, what good is school to someone like you?" The laughter grew louder. The boy clenched his fists under the desk but said nothing. He was used to this, the doubt, the mocking. But today, something inside him hardened. That evening, instead of heading straight home, he took a detour to the old payphone at the edge of the village. He dug out a crumpled business card from his pocket, one given to him months ago by a stranger in a sleek car who had stopped to ask for directions. The man had been impressed by the boy's quick thinking and had said, "If you ever need anything, call this number." With shaking hands, the boy dialed. A deep voice answered. And with just a few words, everything changed. The next morning, the schoolyard was buzzing with gossip about the boy's absence. The teacher smirked, assuming he had finally given up. Then, the sound of roaring blades cut through the air. A helicopter descended onto the field, sending dust flying. The doors opened, and the entire school froze in shock at who stepped out. The morning air was thick with the usual chatter of students milling about the schoolyard before class. The boy's empty seat had already become the subject of jokes. "Guess he finally realized he belongs in the dirt," one student sneered. The teacher, arms crossed, watched the classroom door with a satisfied smirk. "Some children just don't have the capacity for education," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Better they learn their place early." But just as the bell rang, a distant thrumming noise cut through the sky. At first, it was faint, like summer thunder rolling in from the horizon. Then, it grew louder. And louder. Heads turned. Students rushed to the windows. A sleek black helicopter, its blades whipping up dust, descended onto the empty field beside the school. Gasps erupted. The principal, a balding man with round spectacles, nearly tripped over his own feet rushing outside. No one ever came to this school by helicopter. No one important, anyway. The door slid open. And out stepped the boy. He wasn't in his usual worn-out clothes. Instead, he wore a crisp uniform, dark pants, a pressed white shirt, and a blazer with an emblem no one recognized. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with something new, confidence. Behind him, 2 serious-looking men in suits stepped out, scanning the crowd like bodyguards. The entire school stood frozen. The teacher's mouth hung open. "What is this?" The boy didn't even glance her way. He walked straight to the principal and handed him an envelope. "Sir, I've been granted a transfer to the National Science Academy. My new headmaster sent this for your records." The principal fumbled with the paper, his eyes widening as he read. This is a full scholarship. Signed by the Minister of Education himself." Murmurs exploded like wildfire. The boy turned to face his classmates, some wide-eyed, others shrinking back in shame. Then, finally, he looked at his teacher. She paled. You can't just." "I won't be staying," he said simply. But before I go, I wanted to thank you. A beat of silence. Thank me, she scoffed, though her voice wavered. Yes, he said. For reminding me that where you come from doesn't decide where you're going. And with that, he turned and walked back to the helicopter. As the chopper lifted off, the schoolyard erupted into chaos. Some kids cheered. Others looked like they'd been slapped. The teacher stood rigid, her face a mix of fury and disbelief. But the real shock came later. News spread fast in a small village. By noon, everyone knew, the farmer's son hadn't just left in a helicopter, he'd been personally invited to the country's most elite academy by a powerful benefactor. And that benefactor had a name. A name that made even the principal's hands shake. Flashback to the night before. The boy had stood at the payphone, heart pounding as the line connected. You called, the voice on the other end said, not a question, but a statement. Sir, you said if I ever needed help. I remember. What do you need? The boy took a deep breath. A chance. A pause. Then, the man chuckled. Consider it done. Back in the present, the principal pulled the teacher aside. Do you have any idea what you've done? He hissed. Me? That boy was nothing but. That boy is now under the protection of General Adebayo. The name hit her like a brick. General Adebayo. War hero. Philanthropist. The man who had single-handedly funded schools across the country. And she had just spent months humiliating his newest protégé. By the end of the day, the teacher was summoned to the principal's office. The school board had been notified. Parents were demanding answers. And the boy? He was soaring above the clouds, staring at the shrinking village below. For the first time in his life, he smiled. The elite academy wasn't what the boy expected. Whispers followed him. Charity case. Pity admission. But the biggest shock came when General Adebayo himself walked into the classroom, and said 3 words that changed everything. The helicopter touched down on a manicured lawn, the blades slowing as the boy stepped out. Before him stood a towering iron gate, its bars gleaming under the afternoon sun. Beyond it, sprawling brick buildings with arched windows and polished marble steps stretched as far as he could see. Welcome to the National Science Academy, one of the suited men said. The boy's chest tightened. He had never seen anything like this, no cracked walls, no rusted desks, no smell of old textbooks. This place smelled like money. Like power. A stern-faced woman in a navy blazer approached. You must be our new student, she said, her voice crisp. Follow me. As they walked, students in pristine uniforms turned to stare. Some whispered behind their hands. Others smirked. That's him, a girl muttered. The farmer's son. The boy kept his eyes forward, his fists clenched at his sides. The headmaster's office was lined with trophies and framed degrees. The man himself sat behind a massive oak desk, peering over his glasses. General Adebayo speaks highly of you, he said. But talent alone isn't enough here. You'll have to prove you belong. The boy nodded. Your first class starts in 10 minutes. Advanced mathematics. The moment he stepped into the classroom, silence fell. Rows of students, all in spotless uniforms, all with expensive calculators and leather-bound notebooks, turned to look at him. The teacher, a thin man with a sharp nose, barely glanced up from his papers. Ah. The special admission, he said, dripping with sarcasm. Take a seat. A boy in the front row snorted. Better wipe your shoes first. Wouldn't want dirt on the floors. Laughter rippled through the room. The boy sat in the back, just like before. But this time, his jaw was set. The teacher slapped a test paper on his desk. Let's see if you're as clever as the general thinks. The boy scanned the questions. Calculus. Trigonometry. Problems he'd only ever seen in the old, donated textbooks he studied by candlelight. He picked up his pencil and began to write. 2 days later, the teacher stormed into the headmaster's office. "This has to be a mistake," he snapped, slamming a paper onto the desk. The headmaster adjusted his glasses. "You graded it yourself. No one finishes this test in half the time. No one gets a perfect score." The headmaster leaned back, a slow smile spreading. It seems General Adebayo was right. By lunch, the news had spread. The farmer's son wasn't just keeping up, he was leading. 3 weeks later, a black car pulled up to the academy. Students pressed against the windows as General Adebayo himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform decorated with medals, strode through the courtyard. The boy was called to the headmaster's office. When he entered, the general turned, his stern face breaking into a grin. "You didn't just survive," he said. "You thrived." The boy stood straighter. "I had something to prove, sir." The general's smile faded. "To who?" "Them." He gestured toward the window, where curious faces peered in. "Or yourself?" The boy hesitated. Before he could answer, the general placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come. There's someone you need to meet." The general led him to the school's auditorium, where a crowd had gathered. At the center stood a boy with slicked back hair and a smirk, the same one who had mocked him on his first day. "Ah, General," the boy said smoothly. "An honor, sir." The general didn't smile. "This is my godson," he told the farmer's son. "Top of his class." "Or so I thought." The godson's smirk faltered. "You two will compete in next month's National Math Olympiad," the general said. "Let's see who truly deserves to be here." The room erupted in murmurs. The godson's eyes darkened. "You're comparing me to him?" The general leaned in, his voice low. "No. I'm giving you a chance to catch up." That night, as the boy studied in the library, footsteps echoed behind him. The godson stood there, his usual arrogance replaced with something colder. "You think you're clever?" he hissed. "You think you belong here?" The boy didn't look up. "The test scores say I do." The godson slammed a hand on the table. "Listen, trash. My family built this school. My name opens doors. Yours?" He smirked. "You're a charity case. And after the Olympiad, everyone will know it." He leaned closer. "Quit now. Or I'll make sure you regret it." The boy finally met his gaze. "No." The godson's smile turned dangerous. "Fine. We'll do this the hard way." The Olympiad was supposed to be fair. But when the farmer's son walked into the exam hall, he immediately knew something was wrong. His test paper had been tampered with. And the one person who could help him was the last person he expected. The morning of the National Math Olympiad arrived, and the school buzzed with nervous energy. The boy had spent weeks preparing, working late into the night, solving problems far beyond the academy's curriculum. He knew the godson would do anything to win, but he refused to let fear shake him. As he entered the grand exam hall, rows of polished wooden desks stretched before him, each occupied by the country's brightest students. The godson sat near the front, flashing him a smirk before turning away. Something about that look made the boy's stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. He took his seat, fingers tapping lightly against the desk as he waited for the exam to begin. The proctor handed out the test papers, face down. When the signal came to start, the boy flipped his over, and froze. The first page was blank. Not just blank. Torn. Someone had carefully ripped out the questions, leaving only jagged edges clinging to the spine of the booklet. His pulse roared in his ears as he frantically flipped through the rest. Page 2, blank. Page 3, gone. Only the final section remained intact, but those were the hardest problems, the ones designed to stump even the top students. His head snapped up, scanning the room. The godson was already writing, his pen moving smoothly across the page. Their eyes met for a split second, and the glint of satisfaction in the other boy's gaze confirmed everything. He did this. The boy's hands clenched. If he raised his hand now, reported the sabotage, what would happen? The proctors might give him a new test, but how long would that take? He'd already be behind. Or worse, they might accuse him of lying, of making excuses for his own failure. The godson's family had influence. Who would they believe? A quiet rage settled over him. No. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He picked up his pencil and turned to the last page. If all he had were the hardest problems, then he'd start there. Time blurred as he worked, his mind shutting out everything but the numbers. The equations were brutal, designed to twist logic inside out, but he attacked them with single-minded focus. He'd solved harder in the dim light of his family's shack, with nothing but a stub of pencil and the sound of his father's tired breathing nearby. This was nothing. When the final bell rang, the boy set down his pencil, his fingers stiff. Around him, students groaned, comparing answers. The godson stretched lazily, shooting him a mocking glance as if to say, "How was it?" The boy said nothing. He handed in his half-empty booklet and walked out. The results would take a week. 7 days of whispers, of the godson's friends laughing a little too loud when he passed. 7 days of teachers watching him with pity, as if they already knew his fate. Even the general was silent, no calls, no visits. Then, on the 8th day, the headmaster summoned him. The office was crowded. The general stood by the window, arms crossed. The godson was there too, his usual smirk replaced with something uneasy. And at the headmaster's desk sat a stranger in a sharp suit, a folder in his hands. "You're aware," the headmaster began slowly, "that cheating is grounds for immediate expulsion." The boy's blood turned to ice. "I didn't cheat." The stranger opened the folder. Inside was the boy's test, or what was left of it. "Then explain this." The boy leaned forward. Someone had added to his answers, scribbling in messy, frantic numbers beside his neat work. Obvious fakes. Obvious lies. His voice came out steadier than he expected. "That's not my writing." The godson scoffed. "Of course you'd say that." The general still hadn't spoken. His eyes were fixed on the boy, unreadable. The stranger tapped the paper. "You expect us to believe someone tampered with your test twice? First the missing pages, then this?" The boy met his gaze. "Yes." A beat of silence. Then, "I believe him." The voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned. The proctor from the exam hall stood there, her hands clasped tightly. I saw something." She hesitated, then stepped forward. "I didn't want to get involved, but, after the test, I saw him." She pointed at the godson. "He stayed behind. I thought he was just slow to leave, but—" The godson shot to his feet. "You're lying." The general finally moved. In 3 strides, he was in front of his godson, his voice a low growl. "Look me in the eyes and tell me you didn't touch that test." The godson's mouth opened. Closed. That was all the answer anyone needed. The fallout was swift. The godson was suspended. The boy's scores were recalculated using only the intact portion of his test, and even with just those problems, he'd placed in the top 5. But the real surprise came later, when the general pulled him aside. You could have told me about the test, he said. The boy shook his head. Would it have changed anything? The general studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, no. Because you didn't need it to. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. The International Science Fair in Geneva. They want you. The boy's breath caught. The general smiled. Turns out, someone sent them your real test results. The ones from before the sabotage. He clapped the boy on the shoulder. Talent like yours? It doesn't stay hidden for long. As the boy took the envelope, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about how far he could go. Geneva was a world away from anything the boy had ever known, glittering labs, scholars from every corner of the globe, problems that could change the future. But the moment he stepped off the plane, a man in a dark suit approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. Welcome, he said. We've been waiting for you. And the boy realized, this wasn't just an invitation. It was a test. The boy had never been on a plane before. The roar of the engines, the way the ground fell away beneath him, it should have been terrifying. But as he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching his country shrink into patches of green and brown, all he felt was quiet determination. Geneva's airport was all gleaming steel and hurried strangers speaking languages he didn't understand. He clutched his single bag tighter, scanning the crowd for the university representative who was supposed to meet him. Instead, a man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped forward. Welcome, he said in perfect English, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. We've been waiting for you. The boy frowned. You're with the science fair? The man chuckled, as if this were a private joke. In a manner of speaking. Come. Your mentor is eager to meet you. Before the boy could question further, the man was already walking away, expecting to be followed. Something about his tone left no room for argument. The car that waited outside was sleek, black, with tinted windows. The boy hesitated at the door. Where are we going? Somewhere your talents won't be wasted, the man said smoothly. The science fair is child's play compared to what we do. The boy's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. General Adebayo had arranged the fair himself, he wouldn't have sent some mysterious stranger. But then the man said 5 words that made his breath catch. We know about the test. Not the Olympiad. Not the torn papers. The test. The one no one was supposed to know about. The boy had been alone in the academy library long after midnight when he found it, a single sheet of paper slipped between the pages of an advanced physics text. At first glance, it looked like a complex equation. But the more he studied it, the more wrong it felt. The symbols weren't quite standard. The logic twisted in ways that made his head ache. And at the bottom, a handwritten note. If you can solve this, you're not just smart. You're dangerous. He'd solved it in 2 hours. The next morning, the paper was gone. The car wound through Geneva's streets, climbing into the hills where the buildings grew farther apart, the trees thicker. You took the bait, the man said, watching him. That test was designed to identify minds like yours. Only 3 people in the world solved it unaided. The boy's mouth went dry. Who are you? Instead of answering, the man pointed ahead. A massive glass and steel compound rose from the trees, more fortress than school. The general didn't send you here to play with test tubes, he said. He sent you because wars aren't won with bullets anymore. They're won with this. He tapped his temple. The car stopped at a towering gate. Armed guards stepped forward. The boy's fingers found the door handle, ready to run. When a familiar voice rang out. Enough theatrics. General Adebayo stood in the gateway, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. The man in the suit stiffened. Sir, I was just. Frightening my protégé? The general's gaze locked onto the boy. You were right to be wary. But this is where you need to be. The boy stepped out, his legs unsteady. What is this place? The general's smile didn't reach his eyes. The future. Inside, the facility was a maze of laboratories and lecture halls, but unlike any school the boy had seen. Students, no, operatives, hunched over computers displaying equations that looked like they belonged in science fiction. Maps of foreign cities glowed on massive screens, dotted with markers he couldn't decipher. The world's governments recruit from here, the general explained as they walked. Cryptography. Cyber warfare. Economic destabilization models. The brightest minds solving problems no one admits exist. They stopped before a sealed door. You have a choice, the general said. Return to the science fair, present your project, go home a hero. Or walk through that door and learn what your mind is truly capable of. The boy stared at the keypad beside the door, its display showing a partial equation, one he recognized instantly. It was the same test. The one that called him dangerous. He looked at the general. Why me? For the first time, the man's stern facade cracked, revealing something almost like regret. Because the world isn't kind to boys like you, he said quietly. But it fears men like the one you could become. The boy reached for the keypad. And made his choice. Behind the door lay a world of shadows, where equations could topple governments and the right algorithm was deadlier than any weapon. But as the boy's skills grew, so did the whispers. He's not just talented. He's unpredictable. And in this world, unpredictability was the one thing they wouldn't tolerate. The boy stepped through the door into a room that seemed to breathe technology. Walls lined with servers hummed softly, their blinking lights like constellations in the artificial twilight. A dozen faces turned toward him, young, old, all bearing the same sharp intensity in their eyes. These weren't just students. They were strategists, thinkers, warriors of a new kind of battlefield. The general's hand rested heavily on his shoulder. Meet your new classmates. The best minds from 17 nations. A murmur rippled through the room as the boy took in the array of screens displaying what looked like financial markets, power grids, even satellite feeds of unfamiliar cities. First lesson, said a woman with silver-streaked hair and piercing green eyes. Everything you see here stays here. The work we do doesn't exist. The skills you learn don't exist. You, she paused, locking eyes with him, won't exist, as far as the outside world is concerned. The training began that same hour. No gentle introductions, no review of basics. They threw him into deep water immediately, complex simulations of economic collapses, cyber attacks on infrastructure, psychological operations designed to influence populations. At first, he struggled. The concepts were alien, the pace brutal. But then something clicked. The same mind that had solved impossible math problems in a dirt-floored shack began adapting, absorbing, excelling. Days blurred into weeks. The boy, no longer a boy really, found himself rising through the ranks of this strange, secretive program. His natural intuition for patterns and systems made him particularly adept at predictive modeling. By the third week, he was running scenarios even the instructors found impressive. It was during one such session that he first noticed the watchers. Two men in civilian clothes observing from the back of the room, taking careful notes. They didn't participate, didn't speak to anyone. Just watched. Especially him. You're drawing attention, whispered Lena, a Romanian girl who had become his closest thing to a friend in the program. The wrong kind. He learned about the selection that night. Not everyone who entered the program would leave as an operative. Some would be deemed unsuitable. Others would be deemed too valuable to ever leave. The general visited less frequently now, always in hushed conversations with the faculty. The boy noticed how their eyes would flick toward him during these meetings. He began working harder, pushing himself further, not just to succeed but to prove, to whom, he wasn't sure, that he belonged here. Then came the final simulation. An all-encompassing test of everything they'd learned, with real-world stakes. The briefing room was tense that morning. Even the usually unflappable instructors seemed on edge. "This isn't an exercise," the silver-haired woman said. "The scenario you're about to run is active. The decisions you make today will have real consequences." The simulation dropped them into a geopolitical crisis. A small nation's banking system was collapsing. Neighboring powers were mobilizing. The team had to stabilize the situation without direct military intervention. The boy saw the patterns before anyone else. While others focused on the economic indicators, he noticed the anomalies in communication patterns between key officials. The timing of certain transactions. The way the crisis seemed to be following a script, one designed to provoke exactly the response the world was seeing. "It's manufactured," he said suddenly, interrupting 3 separate conversations. "The entire crisis. Look here, and here." His fingers flew across the touchscreen, pulling up data streams others had dismissed as noise. "These aren't random failures. They're markers. Someone's testing us." The room went very still. The silver-haired woman exchanged a look with one of the silent watchers. "Explain." He did. In rapid-fire terms, he laid out how the patterns matched previous exercises they'd run in class, how the timing of certain events was too perfect, how the whole situation felt like a chess game where they were being led to make specific moves. "And who would be doing this testing?" one of the instructors asked carefully. The boy looked around at the faces watching him. The general's absence suddenly felt significant. "We are," he said quietly. "Or rather, someone above us is. This isn't about that small nation at all. It's about seeing what we'll do when we think it's real." A long silence followed. Then, without a word, the simulation ended. Screens went dark. The crisis evaporated. When the boy turned around, the 2 silent watchers were gone. The instructors looked at him with something new in their expressions. Not quite fear. Not quite awe. Something more dangerous, recognition. That night, he found a note slipped under his door. Coordinates. A time. No signature. He went, of course. The meeting place was a secluded bench in the facility's sparse courtyard. The general sat waiting, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes, his posture weary in a way the boy had never seen before. "You weren't supposed to figure it out so quickly," the general said without preamble. The boy sat beside him. "Figure what out? How deep the rabbit hole goes." The general sighed. "That test you found months ago? It wasn't just an entrance exam. It was a way to identify minds that think outside systems. That see through the illusions the rest of us take for reality." The boy's skin prickled. "And what happens now?" The general turned to look at him directly. "Now you choose. Really choose. Because if you continue down this path, there's no going back. You'll see the strings that move the world. And once you see them, you can never unsee them." The boy thought of his village. Of the teacher who had mocked him. Of the helicopter that had carried him away. Of every slight, every obstacle, every moment that had led him here. "What if I want to pull the strings?" he asked. The general's smile was grim. "Then welcome to the real war." As they stood to leave, the boy noticed the glint of a camera lens in the trees. Someone was watching. Someone always was. And for the first time, he found himself wondering not just who was watching, but who he might one day be watching in return. The boy's first real mission came sooner than expected. A simple assignment, they called it, just an observation job in a bustling European capital. His task was to monitor a certain diplomat's movements, track his communications, and report any anomalies. No contact. No interference. Just watch and learn. The general saw him off at the private airstrip. "Remember," he said, gripping the boy's shoulder, "the most dangerous thing in this work is believing you understand what you're seeing. Assume everything is a layer deeper than it appears." The city was a maze of old stone and new glass. The boy blended in easily, just another student with a backpack among thousands. He set up surveillance on the diplomat's residence, tapped into local networks, and began piecing together patterns. But something felt wrong from the start. The diplomat's behavior was too erratic. His meetings too random. The encrypted messages he sent made no sense when decoded. The boy stayed up 3 nights straight, chasing ghosts in the data until his eyes burned. Then, on the 4th day, he saw it. The pattern wasn't in what the diplomat was doing, but in what he wasn't doing. The careful avoidance of certain topics. The way he never looked directly at security cameras. The precise intervals between his random movements. He wasn't the subject of surveillance. He was the surveillant. The boy's fingers trembled as he typed up his report. Before he could send it, his hotel door burst open. 2 men in dark suits, not his handlers, moved with practiced efficiency. One jammed a device into his laptop. The other pressed a gun to his temple. "Walk with us," the first man said pleasantly. "Or die here." They took him to a nondescript office building, through back corridors, down an elevator that descended further than any building this size should have allowed. The room they brought him to was bare except for a metal table and 3 chairs. On the table sat a familiar object, the torn test booklet from the Olympiad. A door opened behind him. The boy turned to see the last person he expected, his old teacher from the village school. She looked different now, her hair styled expensively, her cheap village clothes replaced by a tailored suit. But her smile was the same cruel curve he remembered. "Hello, little farmer," she said. "Did you really think it was coincidence that brought the general to your village?" The walls of reality seemed to bend around him. The teacher, no, the operative, laid out the truth with relish. His entire life had been an experiment. The poverty, the bullying, even his father's struggles, all carefully orchestrated to mold a particular kind of mind. The general wasn't his savior. He was the architect. "And now," she said, sliding a folder across the table, "we see if the experiment worked." Inside were photos of his father, gaunt, frightened, held in some concrete cell. A video played on the tablet she produced next, showing the general being tortured by masked figures. The boy's stomach turned to lead. "Your final test," the woman said. "Prove you're more than just their weapon. Prove you can think for yourself." She wanted him to choose, expose the entire operation, burn his handlers, and save his father. Or prove his loyalty by letting his father die to maintain the program's secrecy. A brutal choice designed to break him either way. The boy sat very still, his mind racing through scenarios. Then he did something no one expected, he laughed. A quiet, broken sound that made the woman's smirk falter. "You still don't understand," he said. "You think this is about loyalty? About choices?" He reached into his pocket and produced his phone, showing a live feed, the diplomat's apartment, where 2 of the boy's classmates were systematically dismantling an entire surveillance operation. "While you were testing me, I was testing you." The woman's face went pale as he continued. The general knew there was a mole. The erratic patterns were bait. "And you," he looked at her with something like pity, "took it." Alarms began blaring throughout the facility. The woman lunged for a hidden panic button, but the boy was faster. A precise strike to the throat dropped her gasping to her knees. The guards rushed him, then collapsed as tranquilizer darts found them from hidden corners of the room. The general walked in, very much unharmed, flanked by the two silent watchers from training. "Well done," he said simply. The boy didn't smile. "My father?" "Safe. Always was." The general's eyes were heavy with something like regret. "But you didn't know that when you made your choice." The realization hit him like a physical blow. This had been one final, cruel test. To see if he would sacrifice everything, even family, for the mission. And he had. The general seemed to read his thoughts. "Welcome to the real cost of this work." He extended a hand. "You're one of us now." The boy looked at the offered hand, then at the unconscious woman who had once mocked him in a dusty classroom. The circle was complete. The farmer's son had become something else entirely. He took the general's hand. Somewhere above them, a helicopter waited to carry him away, not to salvation this time, but to war. A war without fronts, without flags, where the sharpest weapon was the mind that had once solved impossible problems by candlelight. As they ascended into the night sky, the boy, no, the operative, didn't look back at the city lights below. His gaze was fixed ahead, on the dark horizon, where the next battle already waited.